Hi everyone, it's Jim, Great Books, Big Ideas. We're going to go back into the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, his first autobiography. And we are up to chapters 2, 3, and 4, and 5. That's what I want to cover today. So we'll try to move relatively quickly, but I want to do a deep dive here. Not only summarize what's going on, but dive into some close reading of passages. And we got the whiteboard here, so we'll make some notes as we go along. I hope you enjoyed the video. I've got 2 copies here. I've been rereading the narrative in this blank Penguin Classics edition, which unfortunately doesn't have any footnotes, but there are good annotations on the online text, which I have linked to in the show description. But I'm going to look at my marked up, beat up copy, Dover Thrift Edition. $1.50 is all I paid for it. And I got my money's worth out of this. So let's go into chapter 2. We left off with, at the end of chapter 1, with a harrowing scene of the whipping of his aunt Hester, which terrified the young Frederick Douglass, who's growing up as a slave on a Maryland plantation. And now we're going to get into some more details. So one of the things that we've been talking about here with the narrative is the importance of verisimilitude, veracity, authenticity. So he's got to name names, share these details of place, where these plantations were. These are all authenticating details. And you get a lot of that here in chapter 2. So who was the master's family? They had 2 sons, Andrew, Richard, et cetera, Colonel Lloyd, and you get lots of details. You can go visit some of these places in Maryland too. There is a historical site from one of these plantations that I think you can schedule to visit, and I will link to that. If I can find a web link, I'll put it in the show description. But he's giving you a lot of details. One thing here in chapter 2, he talks about the allowance that was given to the slaves for their subsistence. And it was very, very meager. So the men and women slaves received as a monthly allowance of food 8 pounds of pork, or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal, their yearly clothing, 2 coarse linen shirts, linen trousers, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, 1 pair of shoes, whole of which could not have cost more than $7. And the children basically had no clothing, just linen shirts. And if those wore out, you would run around naked until the next allowance day. Okay, so he's getting across like the harsh conditions that they lived under. This included their bedding. So they didn't have beds. They basically slept on the floor. And you had to, not only slavery, not only did you work in the fields, but when you got home, you had to attend to your own meager household and take care of yourself. But then you had to be up at the crack of dawn the next day and make sure you were back and not late, or else the overseer would make you pay. And then we shift over to talking about some of the overseers. The first one is named Mr. Severe, appropriate name. He was a cruel man, a sadist. He took pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity, just totally cruel, and he loved being cruel. He got off on it. I want to mention I think this is the first appearance of a major motif in the book, and that is this theme of providence So I'm going to just make a note of it here. Providence. And be on the lookout for these patterns, like when these keywords come up, and then you can interpret what they mean. Here, Providence was merciful when Mr. Severe died. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of a merciful providence. It's going to come back pretty soon in a new context, but I'm just marking it here so we don't forget it. Now, we have more description of the Great House Farm, which was sort of like the home plantation, and then there was these satellite plantations. So we get a lot of great details about that. And we move on to, how it would be quite a privilege for a slave to be assigned to work at the Great House Farm, because they had it a little better than the ones who worked in the fields. And, they would be very enthusiastic. So if you were selected, then they would make their way through the woods to come to the Great House Farm. And then they would sing. So the whole rest of this chapter is about the songs and the music of the slaves. And there's a lot of irony here, because you could listen to these songs in two ways. They might sound very joyful and happy, but Frederick Douglass is saying these songs always filled him with sadness. He says, I've sometimes thought that the mere hearing of these songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. So here he's using a pathos appeal, saying, just listen to their songs and their music, and you'll know the depth of the suffering that they're experiencing. And he says, I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard as those without might see and hear. They told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. And this always depressed him, filled him with ineffable sadness. And, even as he's writing this narrative, he's brought to tears at this. And he says, to those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. So again, another huge theme, dehumanization. You're going to see that again and again. It's already in this chapter too, where by depriving the slaves of an adequate means of subsistence, you're dehumanizing them. Let's move on to chapter 3. We have some description of a finely cultivated garden. I think it's called the Orangery. And I think this is also a place you can visit now in Maryland on the Eastern Shore. And they grew all kinds of excellent fruit there, and it was quite a temptation for the slaves to have, steal some of that fruit, and they could get into very, very big trouble for that. And that's all described here. Then we have also more setting, the description of the colonel and his splendid riding equipage. His stable and his carriage house presented the appearance of some of our large city livery establishments. And I think what he's meaning to describe here in this passage is that the horses are treated better than the slaves. And also slaves are assigned to take care of these horses. And these masters, like Master and Colonel Lloyd, I guess it is, was meticulous and very had high expectations for how these horses should be cared for. And if you made one false move, or if he perceived that the horse's behavior meant that it wasn't being treated properly, he would blame the slave and punish them. They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when least deserving and escaped whipping when most deserving it. This is an indication of something you see throughout the book, and it relates to our dehumanization theme, that this book really tells you a lot about how the slave system operates on a psychological level, not just in the physical coercion. It's very much about that too, the whipping, the chains, like all that. But it's so much about surveillance, about mind games, about just finding any way to exert power over the oppressed. And not knowing when you're getting punished is part of that. And you don't, times when you deserve to be punished and you're not, and times when you don't deserve to be punished and you are punished. If you grow up around a bully or like an abusive parent or something like that, I probably don't have to tell you that that can be hard, right? So this arbitrary power is really the problem here. I'm going to put the word power down here on the whiteboard as well, because slavery is a system of power. And this is where you can read a book like this, not only for its historical value, it tells you a lot about American slavery, but it's also a tremendously insightful book about how power works. And this can be, power within a family dynamic, power in the workplace, power in our political life, and so forth. And I think, so much of this book continues to resonate because of his true perceptions of how power works. We find out here that, old Barney was whipped, and the slaves can't complain about it either. Like, they have no recourse, so they're just, you just really feel for them, what they had to go through. Colonel Lloyd, of course, very, very wealthy man. Douglas compares him to the riches of Job. So he was said to own 1,000 slaves. And this is an interesting point on page 11 of my Dover edition, this paragraph. Let me read it for you. The colonel, after ascertaining where the slave belonged, rode on. The man also went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been conversing with his master. So in the previous paragraph, Colonel Lloyd talks to a slave, and the slave doesn't know it's Colonel Lloyd, and says, well, does the colonel treat you well? And he says, no. He's honest. He says, no, I'm not treated well. And, he makes us work too hard and so forth. So he didn't realize he was talking to his masters. He thought, said, and heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. The poor man was then informed by his overseer that for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. So he's sold off to the deep South, where circumstances are even worse than Maryland. Immediately chained and handcuffed, without a moment's warning, snatched away from his family and friends, just because he told the truth. And then Douglas makes an interesting insight here. It is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it. And in so doing, prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. This theme of deception, you can't be honest because the consequences are too dire if you tell the truth. I've been frequently asked when a slave if I had a kind master, and I do not remember ever to have given a negative answer, nor did I, in pursuing this course, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false, for I always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us. So you can't tell the truth. If you do, you could be shipped off to another place, you could be whipped, you could be punished, and so forth. And so this culture of deception and surveillance is constantly there. And then another interesting psychological insight is that the slaves sort of compete against one another, and they'll say to one another, like, well, my master's better than your master, and so forth. Very human type of response. It's not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. You know, and then another irony here, these quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the parties. And those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. So this myth that the status, the stature, the goodness of a master was transfers to the slave and makes you relatively better than other slaves is kind of ridiculous, but it's a very human response. Also, he's countering the notion here in these passages that you can't, the other side of this abolitionist debate can't contend, they can't use as evidence, they can't cite as evidence the fact that, well, we don't hear the slaves complain about their condition. You ask a slave, they all say everything's fine, and they wouldn't want anything to change. It's just good old times down on the plantation. No, here he's laying out why you can't take that evidence as evidence. Okay, let's move on to chapter 4. More about overseers here. So we've got Mr. Hopkins, who was there for a while, and then he moved on or left. And then Mr. Gore takes his place. Note again, Douglas is naming names. So, and he is talking about people here who punished and killed. So he's laying it out there. He's saying Mr. Gore was very cruel. And there's a fascinating character portrait of him in chapter 4. He's proud, he's ambitious, he's persevering, he's artful, he's cruel, he's obdurate. He's like almost like the quote ideal overseer, perfectly at home in his job. He was one of those who could torture the slightest look, word, or gesture on a part of the slave into impudence and would treat it accordingly. There must be no answering back to him. No explanation was allowed a slave showing himself to have been wrongly accused. To be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished. That's his rule. He was the most dreaded overseer of the slaves. You really couldn't get away with anything with this guy. Mr. Gore was a grave man. Though young, he indulged in no jokes, said no funny words, seldom smiled. His words were in perfect keeping with his looks, and his looks were in perfect keeping with his words. Overseers will sometimes indulge in a witty word, even with the slaves. Not so with Mr. Gore. He spoke but to command, and commanded but to be obeyed. He dealt sparingly with his words, and bountifully with his whip, never using the former where the latter would answer as well. When he whipped, he seemed to do so from a sense of duty and feared no consequences. Absolute power. He did nothing reluctantly, no matter how disagreeable, always at his post, never inconsistent. He never promised but to fulfill. He was, in a word, a man of the most inflexible firmness and stone-like coolness. His savage barbarity was equaled only by the consummate coolness with which he committed the grossest and most savage deeds upon the slaves under his charge. This is a real wicked guy. And then we get the story, several stories of just outright murder here. This is just absolute power, totally out of control, with no boundaries, nothing holding them back, no consequences, no civil rights, no due process, nothing. Just impunity. So Mr. Gore murders a slave named Demby, who ran into the river to avoid punishment. Gave him like 3 calls and saying, if you don't come out, I'm going to shoot you. Demby didn't come out, and he shot him in cold blood. Killed him. A thrill of horror flashed through every soul upon the plantation, excepting Mr. Gore. He alone seemed cool and collected. Notice how often he's described as being cool, calm, cool, collected, and cruel, too. Then you would think that maybe he would be held to account by the master, Colonel Lloyd, whom the overseer works for. But Mr. Gore replies that you can't let a slave like Demby set a dangerous example. If he was able to get away with anything like this, this would subvert the rule and the order of the plantation. His horrid crime was not even submitted to judicial investigation. This is a theme you hear again, too, later. It was committed in the presence of slaves, and they, of course, could neither institute a suit nor testify against him, and thus the guilty perpetrator of one of the bloodiest and most foul murders goes unwhipped of justice and uncensured by the community in which he lives. They can't sue, they can't testify because they have no civil rights. In the eyes of the law, they're not considered to be human beings. He says down here, I speak advisedly when I say this, that killing a slave or any colored person in Talbot County, Maryland is not treated as a crime, either by the courts or the community. Here's another murderer, Thomas Landman of St. Michael's, killed 2 slaves. One he killed with a hatchet. Here's another one. A woman, the wife of Mr. Giles Hick, Mrs. Hick, killed her slave because she fell asleep while caring for her Mrs. Hick's baby. Beat her, and she died. It did produce a sensation, I guess gossip, but not enough to bring the murderers to punishment. No, there was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. That's as far as it got. She escaped not only punishment, but even the pain of being arraigned before a court for her horrid crime. And here's another one. A poor old man was murdered. One of Colonel Lloyd's slaves, was trespassing and was killed by Mr. Bondley, blew him away. So does this remind you of anything where you have unchecked power, people who are above the law, they can just wantonly murder people they don't like or that they perceive have offended them or broken some kind of rule? indiscriminate violence sounds vaguely familiar to me. And then not arrested, not adequately investigated, not put in jail, not brought to trial. Maybe we'll just get administrative leave. Let's move on to chapter 5, our last of this session. This is really the story of Douglas being transferred to Baltimore. And our Providence team is going to come back in here too. So it so happened that Douglas was living on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, and one of the masters, Daniel Lloyd, was a special relationship. Like Daniel Lloyd was attached to Frederick and protected him. And he did not allow the older boys to impose on him. So he sort of was lucky that way. And he says, I was seldom whipped by my old master and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. And, he gets into, like, again, the deprivation of the coldness, of going around in bare feet, like cracked his feet, the cornmeal mush that they had to eat, and so on and so forth. More sort of realistic details about the life of a slave here. But it was when he was about 8 years old that he left for Baltimore, which was a very fortunate stroke. He's going to get into what happened here. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master had determined to let me go to Baltimore and to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. I received this information about 3 days before my departure, and then they had him wash up and clean himself up, because you have to look a little nicer if you're going to be a city slave. And so there's, he's going about getting spruced up for his big trip to Baltimore. And then he reflects, interestingly, on, the ties that bind or don't bind children to their homes as he's about to leave. He's just thrilled that he has the opportunity to get out of this place. But you might think, well, what if you're leaving your family behind? Isn't that heartrending? He says the ties that ordinarily bind children to their homes were all suspended in my case. I found no severe trial on my departure. My home was charmless. It was not home to me. The slaves didn't really have a home. On parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything which I could have enjoyed by staying. My mother was dead. My grandmother lived far off, so that I seldom saw her. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother that lived in the same house with me, but the early separation of us from our mother had well nigh blotted the fact of our relationship from our memories. Severing the family ties, straining those, is part of how you keep people under your thumb. I looked for home elsewhere and was confident of finding none which I should relish less than the one which I was leaving. If, however, I found in my new home hardship, hunger, whipping, and nakedness, I had the consolation that I should not have escaped any one of them by staying. It's like I'm so far down, it can't get any worse. We're already at the bottom of the barrel. And he's excited to see the big city. Okay, so then they set sail. They stop in Annapolis on the Chesapeake Bay on the way up there. He describes that. And then we get a picture of his meeting his new masters in Baltimore. So here we have Mr. and Mrs. Auld make their appearance. They're both at home. Oh, let me mention where this is, by the way. His new home is in Aliciana Street near Mr. Gardner's shipyard on Fells Point. So if you've been to Baltimore, you probably know Fells Point because it's a bit of a tourist destination now. It's right on the harbor, and it's a cool neighborhood. There's a lot of shops and restaurants and bars and vendors and things like that, markets. And you can go find these addresses. I think there's a historical marker in front of a house where Frederick Douglass lived at this time. And it's a very walkable neighborhood too. I visited there. There was just a sidebar. Like, my wife was giving a presentation at an academic conference in Baltimore. And we went down for the day because we're only an hour and a half, 2 hours from Baltimore. So we drove down there, took our Boston Terrier, Alfie, along. He always would travel with us as much as possible. And so I had a lot of time to kill. So I dropped her off. We didn't stay in a hotel, so I just dropped her off at the convention center, and then I had to kill hours of time. So the first place I went was, I tried to get in to see where Edgar Allan Poe is buried because he died in Baltimore. So I found that churchyard, but the gates were locked. So, we didn't make it in there. I think I could see the grave. I might have a picture of it somewhere. But yeah, unfortunately, it was still early in the morning, and I couldn't see it for real. So then I wandered down around the Inner Harbor area, and I found my way to Fells Point and found a place to park. And I just walked that neighborhood. Like, we kind of hung out there for quite a while. And yeah, it was really a pretty cool place. And then I think I walked past the house where Frederick Douglass stayed, but I know I was right within a block or two of it. But anyway, if you ever go to Baltimore, it's someplace you might want to check out. Okay, so they live in Fells Point. Mr. and Mrs. Auld were both at home, met me at the door with their little son Thomas to take care of whom I had been given. So his job is going to be to take care of Thomas, the boy. And here I saw what I had never seen before. It was a white face beaming with the most kindly emotions. It was the face of my new mistress, Sophia Auld. I wish I could describe the rapture that flashed through my soul as I beheld it. It was a new and strange sight to me, brightening up my pathway with the light of happiness. Little Thomas was told there was his Freddie, and I was told to take care of little Thomas, and thus I entered upon the duties of my new home with the most cheering prospect ahead. He's never had a white person look at him this way before, and he just lights him up. Now this is a key paragraph where our theme of providence comes up twice. I look upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. It is possible and even quite probable that but for the mere circumstance of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind providence which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. There's your providence theme. I regarded the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were a number of slave children that might have been sent from the plantation to Baltimore. There were those younger, those older, and those of the same age. I was chosen from among them all and was the first, last, and only choice. This twist of fate, Providence watching over him, he's the one that got picked. And then he says in the last paragraph of this chapter, I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical in regarding this event as a special interposition of divine providence in my favor. But I should be false to the earliest sentiments of my soul if I suppressed the opinion. That's truly what he thought. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others. That's a way to live, folks, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom. This good spirit was from God, and to him I offer thanksgiving and praise. So he's pulling on religious rhetoric, religious language here, calling upon God, seeing divine influence, shaping things, hidden hands, the angels, God watching over him. It's providential. But there's also coming out in this passage a lot of self-reliance, inner strength. There's something inside this man. He has fortitude, he has conviction, he has faith and hope that slavery will not defeat him. Now, where that comes from, is that a God-given part of your human nature? Something to think about. But you're going to see this kind of interplay between how much of this story is due to him being self-reliant and resourceful and having courage and fortitude and like sticking to it and making his way and finally out of slavery. How much of it has to do with destiny or providence or fate, luck, and how much of it has to do with the helping hands of others? That's something you're going to find out later in the book as well. So that covers our passage, our chapters for today. In the next installment of this series, I want to do chapters 6 and 7. That's it, 6 and 7. And this is going to tell you the story. This is going to tell you the story of Frederick Douglass learning to read and write and the interesting transformation of Mrs. Auld, which I will reserve for the next time. But these are the chapters that often get excerpted and put into readers. Very famous stuff. It's so much to talk about. Can't wait to talk about it with you again. Thanks for watching. Hope you're reading. So read 6 and 7 for next time if you're following along. And we'll see you soon. Bye.